thank you so much. We have a presentation today from two really wonderful people, thoughtful people that have been engaging with us in the context of our small scale fisheries network and also in OFI, Mr. Barry Darby and Ms. Helen Forsey. And I'm really so excited to have them present today. They're going to go through a presentation and talk to you a little bit about their ideas, correct?
Right. So
this is a really awesome opportunity to hear some new thinking. And so without further ado, Helen and Barry on changing course, research and advocacy on harvesting policy.
Thanks very much, Evan. Just a quick introduction of each of us. Barry Darby grew up on a fishing room on Great Barren Island. He's fished with his father for several years before becoming a science instructor at the College of the North Atlantic here in St. John's. In the 1990s, he was coordinator of the Fisheries Adjustment Program at the college, and one way or another, he's been working on fishery policy ever since. My name is Helen Forsey. I'm a writer, translator, and activist with a background in agriculture and policy analysis. I've been working with Barry on fishery issues for the past 4 years. Our basic policy paper, Changing Course, a New Direction for Canadian Fisheries, is on our website along with much else.
Hi, everyone. Taking a look at the first slide here now. In Changing Course, Helen and I research fishery policy, and we advocate for change. Government policies underline and regulate most of the activities that fish harvesters and processors engage in. That's what fisheries governance is all about, and we need to get it right. So what are the existing policies, and why are they not ensuring a sustainable fishery? In this session, we propose a paradigm shift in policy direction that will radically change the framework that now exists to one that will increase benefits for all concerned. Before we begin, here's a brief outline of those 90 minutes. The first part will be a presentation on an alternate framework for fisheries management, followed by a brief chance to ask some clarifying questions. The second half of the session will be interactive, beginning first of all with small groups and continuing in the group as a whole before wrapping up. At the end, you'll have a new window for looking at fishery management and an alternate framework for implementing sustainable fishery policies.
Next slide. What should be the goal of fishery policy? Most people would agree it's sustainability, but sustainability isn't just a single simple thing. Look at it as a stool with 3 legs: environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and economic sustainability. The stool needs all 3 legs in order to stand. If any leg is missing or weak or too long, for example, the whole sustainability stool will overbalance and collapse. Likewise, good fishery policy rests on all 3 legs. The policies need to optimize the ecological, social, and economic benefits for the present and future. Here's one of my favorite quotes. If weigh to the better there be, it exacts a full look at the worst. That's how Thomas Hardy put it back 100 and some years ago, perhaps never realizing how perfectly it would apply to fishery management, but it does. So, since we're looking for a way to the better for managing our fisheries, first we have to look at the worst. The Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans bases their management system on quotas. They call it a precautionary approach framework, or PA framework, but it's not working. Their current approach is just not sustainable. Look at the evidence. The Northern Cod moratorium, 30 years now and counting. The drastic decline of cod in 3PS in the past 2 decades on the South Coast. The continuing struggle of harvesters to just make a living on the water. The ongoing decimation of coastal communities. The way we're fishing further and further down the food web, as Daniel Pauly warns. DFO's policy framework is not protecting the ecosystem as it should, and it's not maximizing benefits for harvesters or coastal communities either. So we've been getting it wrong. Over there.
What we're proposing is an alternate framework, a new way of looking at the problem. We're calling it a paradigm shift. both in thinking, in policy, and then in practice. In Changing Course, we wrote a quote: "Anomalies in a paradigm are evidence of the need for a paradigm shift. And as Helen has just pointed out, there's no shortage of anomalies." We propose a better way that's in keeping with the focus of this small-scale fishery congress, in particular with getting governance right. But what is that better way? First, our overall policy direction should incentivize small-scale fisheries rather than encouraging and subsidizing large corporate industrialized fishing as done at present. Secondly, we must change our policy so that fish harvesting is managed almost exclusively by input controls or effort, not by quota. We'll explain that in more detail later. And thirdly, we need to reduce the pressure on stocks. A major review published in Nature in 2020 called Rebuilding Marine Life states or recommends, among other things, a reduction in fishing pressure on the stocks. So by controlling fishing effort, we reduce that pressure, monitor the results to make sure what's happening. This is the shift that we must make from quotas to effort.
So managing nature, question mark. We're talking about a paradigm shift in management. But before Barry comes back to detail the specifics of the solution we propose, I want to step back and set the context at a more general level. There are three interrelated aspects to this. First, we humans are part of the natural world, not separate from it. As climate change is showing us, we're not in charge. So we need to recognize that in fishery management, we're not in charge either. We can't manage the fish. We can manage the fishery, which is the human activity. Secondly, Indigenous traditions are grounded in that reality, the fact that we're all part of the ecosystem. That reality is reflected at every level in Indigenous languages and cultures. As Potawatomi scientist and poet Robin Wall Kimmerer explains, the Indigenous concept of the honourable harvest bases its unspoken rules on respect and reciprocity with all our relations. Never take take only that which is given. Harvest in ways that minimize harm. Never take more than half. Never waste, and more. The rest of us are slowly starting to pay attention to those profound Indigenous understandings, but it's still baby steps. Finally, in fisheries circles internationally, there is now considerable agreement that fishery management should look at the whole ecosystem and work with it instead of trying to manage single species in separate theoretical silos. Obviously, the ocean is not divided into silos, and that fragmented approach is out of touch with reality. DFO plans to eventually move towards an ecosystem approach, but they're still managing the fisheries species by species and stock by stock. It's a slow process. Next one. The principles behind the framework that we're proposing in our paper Changing Course, we set out those 4 principles. Here's the basis of what we're proposing. Principle: the ocean's ecosystems must be kept healthy. All harvesting must be done in sustainable ways. Secondly, the ocean is a commons, and as the FAO recommends, harvesters have use rights to harvest that commons sustainably, but it's not private property. Third, the management system must provide optimum net economic returns to harvesters and coastal communities, otherwise the fishery is not sustainable. And fourth, implementation and management must be as simple and effective as possible.
We have to recognize that we are predators. Dr. Chris Derryman from the University of Victoria writes about humans as super predators because we're the only apex predators that has wiped out or brought to the edge of extinction any number of prey species. Derryman's research shows that wild non-human predators preserve their stocks of their prey by taking mainly the young. We should mimic those non-human predators if we want to harvest sustainably. And we can do that by harvesting selectively, mainly through our choice of gear. By using selective harvesting, we can actually increase the size of the harvest while simultaneously improving the sustainability of the stock. This is a win-win situation, and the next slide helps to illustrate it. What you see here is a typical curve showing stock abundance declining over time. Areas B, C, and D represent the harvestable biomass. Notice that the greatest abundance is in area D. The dotted line between B and C shows the smallest size we normally catch with gill nets. We should be using selective gear to target the area B. That way we will mimic wild predators, maximize the catch, leaving the young and the old, and we maintain sustainability. I'll have more to say about selective harvesting later, and Helen will talk about super spawning stock biomass, that small space down in the corner there, where the big motherfish reside. We sometimes refer to our methodology as the lobster model because it bears a lot of relation to that. The key aspect of it is that it has no quota. When I attended a talk by Dr. Darrimont a few years ago, where he talked about humans as super predators, I had an aha moment. That's how we harvest lobster. We mimic wild predators. So this is how we harvest lobsters in Newfoundland, a process which actually puts Dr. Darrimont's science into practice. Key element of the lobster model is that there is no quota. Instead, the rules specify the type of gear, number of traps, the size of the opening, etc. This regulates the size of the lobster caught and thus protects the young juveniles. To protect spawning females, harvesters must return egg-bearing and phenatch lobsters to the ocean. This ensures that the annual catch consists almost entirely of animals from the middle area of the stock graph. There's a defined harvest season, giving the stock and the ecosystem a chance to adapt to this large removal of lobster biomass. Most of those measures mimic the behavior of wild predators, and we end up with a large harvest when lobsters are plentiful and smaller ones when they are scarce. This harvest management system, which was begun after a 3-year moratorium in the 1920s, has produced a highly successful lobster fishery for more than 90 years. This is both sustainable and profitable. Again, no quotas. Harvesting is managed by regulating the fishing effort involved, and our proposed alternate system is modeled in large part on this. This booklet right here is the original 1927 booklet. All 4 pages of it. It contains the complete harvesting and processing rules issued when the management system was first started for lobster. And it shows how simple harvest regulations can be as compared with the complexities of fishery science. The current rules may have added a lot of words, but the practices themselves remain roughly the same as they have been for 90 years. And lobster remains one of the most successful fisheries, economically and ecologically. We have to look at that as a lesson for our other fisheries.
Okay. Given all this then, how do we go about managing our fisheries? Think of it as DFO's fishery managers having a toolbox with a set of tools. Fisheries management involves choosing which tools to use and how to best combine them. The 5 main tools in the fishery manager's toolbox can be divided into 2 groupings, stated as questions. The 2 groupings are input controls and output controls. These 2 approaches are outlined in the FAO's Fishery Manager's Guidebook. They can be shown, the 2 approaches can be shown as the 5 questions listed on the slide. These are the 2 sets of tools that we use in implementing either type of system, input controls or output controls. The alternative framework that we advocate in Change of Course is an input control system. That's the one on the left there, 4 questions. Regulates the fishing effort, the who, how, when, and where are harvested. We refer to that system as effort-based management. The system currently used by DFO is an output control system. It tries to control the fishery's output, how much gets harvested. It relies heavily, not exclusively, but heavily on calculating total allowable catches and allocating quotas. They call it their PA framework. We refer to it as quota-based management.
What we propose is an input control system and it uses only the first 4 tools. First tool is who can fish. Our rule would be that only certified harvesters who have registered their home port would be able to fish commercially. Second tool, how. This regulates the gear, the size, number, methods, etc. And some examples would be for a hook and line harvesters would use 1,200 baited hooks a day. On a trawler, 12 harvesters would use 1 otter trawl. And other size limits would be implied, such as the length of a net or a line, the volume of a pot or trap. So I'll come back to this again in the next slide. The third and fourth tools are seasons and zones, the when and where of harvest management. Seasons would be set for specific zones. And if we increase the use of marine spatial planning, many more zones and subzones would currently exist. Here's an important takeaway. Those 4 questions all have answers that can be easily and accurately identified, measured, complied with, and enforced. There are no unknowns. The necessity for effective management. In contrast, as we shall see shortly, the current system managed by quota is full of unknowns. Here's a tool that could be used is a gear sustainability index. Gear is a key part of how we fish. And this is a slide we found showing how gear can be ranked according to sustainability. The specifics might be different for different species and areas, but it reflects what we were saying earlier with the stock graph about how managing the type and amount of gear can help us harvest selectively. You'll see that those gears lowest down on the slide, hand lines, pots, and traps, and long lines in particular, are considered less severe and therefore more sustainable fishing methods. They harvest selectively, catching disproportionately more of the abundant smaller fish. In contrast, those near the top are less sustainable. Bottom gill nets actually target the larger fish, especially the mother fish. Bottom trawls are even worse, catching everything indiscriminately. In the effort-based management system we propose, regulation will actually favor the more sustainable gear. Another aspect of our proposal is positive inefficiencies, which will ensure next year's harvest. Modern discoveries and technologies now give us the ability to fish out most species in a few years or even less. We no longer need to improve the efficiency of a gear. If we want to ensure sustainability of species, we need to leave animals in the water for the coming years. This means that fishery policies need to ensure a degree of inefficiency in their gear, so allowing some fish to escape. Some gear is naturally inefficient. For example, baited hooks only remain effective for a few hours. Traps catch mainly small fish. Small seines can encircle only part of the school. Other types of gear can be made inefficient by allowing certain sizes of fish to escape, usually by specifying mesh size or limiting overall length and depth. Again, all of these factors can be accurately measured, specified, and managed. This is a unique idea. We use inefficient gear and we ensure sustainability. Oops. So.
The contrast our approach that Barry has just been describing with the way our fisheries are currently managed under the current DFO system, which we're calling quota-based management, uses mainly the 5th tool, how much. It attempts to determine how much fish we should harvest from a given stock in a given year. Here's how it's done, as we understand it. DFO managers use survey data mainly to estimate the biomass of a given stock. These data, which have high margins of error, are then fed into computers along with reference points calculated from historical data, which also involve multiple major variables and unknowns. The computers then model various future scenarios as best they can, plotting biomass numbers and removals on a graph. The point on the graph where 2 lines intersect leads to a decision on the total allowable catch, the fundamental basis for DFO's harvest management planning. That framework, the PA framework, does use some input tools as well, with some regulations for gear, licensing, seasons, and zones. But input considerations are overridden by the top priority, setting tax and quotas. Nothing can Nothing can contravene that. Those tax and quotas are the final arbiter to determine DFO's harvest policies. But this quota-based system is badly flawed, and we're going to explain that next.
We write in our changing course that the task that DFO has is impossible. Take a look at this graph. It shows the estimated spawning biomass for 2J3KL cod. This is probably one of the most highly researched of all of Canada's fish stocks. DFO's stock assessments are between 300 and 500 kilotons. In other words, there's a margin of error of plus or minus 25%. For other stocks, it's even more uncertain than that. In addition, historically in a day, humans have sustainably harvested at least 10 to 30% of this and similar cod stocks. When you do the math on that, you'll see that you'll get a TAC or yield of between 30 and 150 kilotons. That's a huge range of answers. But for a TAC, you need an exact number. So there's a huge risk of getting it wrong. This Congress is about getting it right. Overfishing. Getting it right would mean, among other things, preventing overfishing. We can all agree that fishing is, quote, a fishery that removes more fish than biological production can replace, unquote. That's like Russell in 1931. From an operational point of view, however, harvest managers must set limits that can prevent overfishing. So our question, what do we need to limit? The amount of fish to be caught or the effort that is exerted? This is the key aspect of the debate we wish to have with you in this session. Our view is that we must place limits on the, mainly on the effort. For us, overfishing is fishing too much, not catching too much. For example, if you had 100 trawlers with huge otter trawls working over the same area continually for a year, is overfishing, regardless of whether they catch a little or a lot. Moreover, with effort-based management, we can actually establish, quantify, and adhere to, monitor, and enforce all the elements involved. This is not so with tax.
There's a parallel problem with quota-based management that we'll call underfishing. Since tax and quotas are based on uncertain data and assumptions, they often limit us to catching much less than we could safely catch sustainably. This is what fishery experts have referred to as foregone harvests. Foregone harvests unnecessarily lead to major economic losses for harvesters, processors, and communities. They can also be bad for the fish stock itself. For example, if there are more hungry fish than the available food supply can support, those fish will be in poor condition and there'll be starvation. In such cases, leaving too many fish in the water is ecologically counterproductive. Solution? Fish selectively, managing the fishing effort, the how, and the when, and the where, so as to catch more of the hungry predator fish, thus leaving more prey for the remaining ones to eat. Those remaining fish will be in better condition and can then grow, reproduce, and more effectively replenish the stock. Effort-based management prevents both overfishing and underfishing. Its built-in feedback loops and selective harvesting methods enable us to catch more fish when fish are plentiful, with appropriately lower harvests when fish are scarce. That way we can fish less effort, and catch more. Next. So we raise the question, reluctantly, but is the current system actually precautionary, or at least as precautionary as it needs to be? With the clear decline of major marine species over the past 7 decades, many respected fisheries scientists and advocates like Daniel Pauly have called for a precautionary approach. Although DFO's quota-based management system is an attempt to implement precaution, the evidence shows that it doesn't work out that way in practice. More than 700 years ago, St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, "If the highest aim of a captain were to preserve his ship, he would keep it in port forever." Similarly, if people are so fearful of damaging the stocks that they essentially stop fishing, they don't understand our ecosystem role as apex predators, a role that human harvesters fill by fishing sustainably. The proof is clear in small-scale fisheries like our lobster, not to mention 450 years of sustainable cod fishery here in Newfoundland and Labrador. The solution is not to keep removals as low as possible. It's to reduce fishing pressure to where feedback shows that we're doing it sustainably. That is what our proposed effort-based management framework does. Another problem with quota-based management is that it uses biomass estimates as the main basis for harvest policy and planning. These biomass figures are important, but they measure, or rather estimate, the total weight of fish in a given stock. But that ignores some key factors of sustainability. For example, there's the phenomenon of reproductive hyperometry. Took me a while to get my tongue around that one. That refers to the fact that big, old, fat, fecund female fish, boths, produce more eggs and more surviving larvae than the equivalent weight of smaller fish, perhaps as much as an order of magnitude more. But total allowable catches are defined in terms of biomass. A kilo of fish is a kilo of fish, regardless of age, fecundity, or the condition of the fish. So that important complexity isn't adequately taken into account in the quota-based system. As Dustin Marshall and his co-authors put it in a recent paper on this, failing to consider reproductive hyperallometry overestimates the efficacy of traditional fisheries management and underestimates the benefits of approaches that create reservoirs of larger individuals. Our proposed effort-based management framework embodies precisely such an approach.
Okay, let's take a final look at the problems with the current quota-based management system. We want our oceans to be sustainable, economically, socially, and environmentally. A good management system should accomplish this. But in fact, basic fisheries management, mainly on quotas, as is currently done, actually works against sustainability. Quota-based management tacitly allows all fishing methods and gears. As long as you catch your quota, you can use mostly whatever gear you want, with the main limit being the number of tons of fish you catch. This means that most harvesters will use gear that catches as much as possible, as quickly as possible, which is often the least sustainable gear. And given our capitalistic, market-driven economy, the ones with capital go big, bigger boats, get larger trawls, etc. Moreover, those large-scale gears are often not compatible with slower, more inefficient, and less destructive gear types. As a result, small-scale fishers using hooks, pots, traps are effectively barred from the ocean, or at most have limited access. In practice then, the quota-based system favors large-scale industrial fisheries, and this favoritism is directly tied to DFO's policies and regulations. This is where it's coming from. And we don't have time to go into all the detailed list of negatives associated with quota-based BA framework, but here's a few. High carbon emissions, biodiversity loss, habitat destruction, plastic pollution, low quality products, waste of protein, exploitation of labor, outmigration, privatization of the ocean commons, flight of wealth from coastal community. You heard a lot of these fears and these problems voiced earlier on the day this morning. Those problems can be resolved or significantly reduced by small-scale fisheries managed by effort controls. And changing course, we're about solutions.
Now let's look at the benefits of the solution we're proposing. Effort-based management works with nature instead of making futile attempts to control it. Our proposed system contains feedback loops that lead to a largely self-regulating harvest, reducing fishing pressures on fish stocks and other marine life. Effort-based management enables us to identify and respond to the ever-changing ocean realities like food supply, natural predation, water temperature, disease, migration, all of which influence the sustainability of our harvesting. With the use of more sustainable harvesting gear and methods, there will be much less damage to habitat and to the marine food chain, enhancing marine biodiversity. Our approach will also reduce bycatch, reduce carbon emissions, and reduce plastic pollution. As effort-based management becomes established, the ecological benefits will translate into economic and social benefits to coastal communities and to the economy and society as a whole. Thanks to the more sustainable fishing practices under this approach, fish will become more plentiful, enabling larger harvests, benefiting both harvesting and processing sectors. Higher quality products and better prices, combined with lower expenses, will increase harvest efficiency and result in greater net returns. The shift in policy will result in less bycatch, reducing the corresponding waste and economic losses. With the problem of foreground harvests resolved, economic activity will increase at both the local level and more broadly. As people realize the benefits accruing from effort-based management, harvesters will increasingly opt for smaller boats and slow fishing practices. This will reduce the overcapitalization of the fleet and make it easier for younger people to get into harvesting. The increased economic activity in coastal communities will strengthen local economies and help coastal communities and our Newfoundland and Labrador culture survive and thrive.
Okay, so what are the actions that we need to take to get it right? First, DFO must begin immediately to shift to effort-based management. Now, implementing this major change will be complex and will take some time, but it can be started immediately. And the transition process must be structured so that as issues arise, they can be addressed. Secondly, the government should formally prioritize the goal of maximizing net economic benefits for harvesters and coastal communities. As a basic, this should be a basic element of fishery policy. If the fishery does not result in optimum benefits for harvesters and the communities, this is mismanaging resource. All three legs of the sustainability stool are essential. And small-scale fisheries managed by effort can strengthen all three. 2021 to 2030 is the UN Ocean Decade. There's no better time than now to make this vitally important change of course. Here are some other important elements of our approach that must be part of the policy shift we are advocating. First, all commercial harvesters should be certified, and the model that is used currently with trades, known as the Red Seal program, could be a model. Bycatch. All dead bycatch should be landed and recorded. DFO's current bycatch policies require or encourage the unreported dumping of valuable protein. Iceland's policy and practices on bycatch addresses this issue, and we should look at it. The collection, analysis, and use of relevant data must be vastly improved and expanded as a basis for more and better research and regulation. DFO is way behind the rest of the economy in this area. Another, separation between harvesting and the processing sectors must be clear, legislated, and well enforced. We need regulated competition at the wharf's edge. And again, we can look at Iceland and Norway for examples. And finally, harvesting and fishing communities must be involved in the decision-making at fishery policy at all levels. Policies and regulations should be and can be designed to enable harvesters in the communities to make as many of their own decisions as possible.
So there you have a sketch of two competing frameworks, the quota system that DFO calls its PA framework, and our proposal for basing fishery management on regulating fishing effort. Although we've only just scratched the surface in this presentation, our intent is to advocate a paradigm shift in fishery governance that will lead us on a sustainable course into the future. Now, we were going to break into small groups so that it looks as though we've got ready-made small groups here already. So if, I think maybe, shall we just go with the whole, continuing with a few questions of clarification to start with, just to clarify if something's unclear or if there's a major gap that we've missed in what we've been presenting, and we can always figure out how to go back and forth to a particular slide if there was one that you wanted to ask what we meant or something like that. And then get into the interactive discussion in the small groups. Everybody would have a chance to talk, but I think with this number of people in the room, everybody will have a chance to talk anyway. And we'd like to hear your challenges to us, your criticisms of what we've been saying, your appreciation, of course, of any points we've made that you agree with, and to know if you sort of challenge each other, if among you there's disagreement, we want to listen in on how you disagree and how you respond, or how you agree too. So if we could first go then to questions of clarification, and just keeping the questions really short and saving the commentary for after 5 minutes from now, when hopefully everything is clarified and we can get into the actual discussion.
Okay, does anyone have a sort of a further explanation of any of the slides that you've seen? Oh, sorry, yes, go ahead.
I had a question, but I'll leave that till afterwards. You know, the moratorium. But I think related, for sure, slide on the
Sir,
total allowable.
I can't,
Oh,
Sorry, I'm just trying to get to the slide where you put up the estimates of the cost from 2J3L.
Okay, yeah, now let me go back to that. If I go back to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you just,
This one?
yeah.
Yeah.
You had the estimate at 300 to 500
Kilotons.
metric tons. Potential growth in table turtle. Then you had the yield at turkey to 150. What did you mean? That's what I guess the potential, but how does that? How do you quantify? What are you even saying here? I'm not quite.
Okay. I think I get your question. The 300 to 500 kiloton comes from stack assessments from 2016 to now.
Yeah.
And so that's how much cod is out there. And a key part of that is the uncertainty that exists in the kind of measurements that we do of stock biomass. The second line, potential growth. If we look back at last hundreds of years in Newfoundland, if we look at Norway and in Russia and Bering Sea, which is they're taking, I think, as high as 40%. It is a reasonable that we should be able to take anywhere from 10 to 30. It's often higher than that, but we use 10 to 30 just to illustrate. If you multiply 10% times 300, you get 30. If you multiply 30% times 500, you get 150. That's a wide range of values. DFO comes up with in the last quotas for 2J3KL with 12.9. And what we're saying is that with such an uncertainty in both the estimated stock spawning biomass and what is a potential, it's impossible to come up with 12.9.
or even
That's-
within it.
Yeah, is that
Is
clear?
Yeah, I'm with you now.
Okay.
I wasn't sure what
Okay.
you were talking about.
Yeah.
I'm a victim of the moratorium, so that's why I am, I'm a victim of the moratorium.
Yeah.
That's why I asked the question.
Can I, yeah, in a second, after I want to ask a little bit about where each of you is coming from what your experience is with the fishery, because then I think we could be more intelligent, answer or respond more intelligently too.
Okay,
So, yes.
I mean, and maybe this is more the discussion than a clarification question, but and I agree with you that this is why I work for DFO, for Fisheries Management, like faced with this kind of problem all the time, when there's a lot of uncertainty and you're trying to pick a number in that, kind of environment. But I guess if you were managing through effort, I mean, presumably there's also a lot of uncertainty around the right parameters, So I guess, like, for example, like the 2J3K on cod stock, if you wanted to manage it primarily through effort, like, would you see, I mean, like, so you're looking at both gill net mesh sizes, or do you know what I mean? Like, so those factors, I think also, I would assume there's a lot of uncertainty there too, I think. So I'm
well,
just curious
depends
about how
on-
you,
it depends on how the uncertain, there's almost no uncertainty in what you are managing. For example, the who, you can know on, say, the beginning of start of January, you can know how many harvesters there are between Cape Bald and Cape Race. You can know exactly, there's no uncertainty in that. If you tell them they can use 1,000 hooks a day, then 1,000 times the number of harvesters is almost exactly, to 99% accuracy, how much effort is being placed. If you open season on the 1st of August and you keep it closed at the end of November, you know exactly how many days you're on. These are the tools, and if you say you put limits, boundary limits on your areas, be it a contour line on the bottom or a longitudinal latitude lines. These are specific. You can measure every one of those to 99% accuracy. So that's what I mean when I say the uncertainty that exists in quota-based is there, and it's quite large, as we've just shown. But on the other 4 tools, we can state these exactly.
I think so. I guess I'm still just thinking, though, you still have to choose your number of hooks, like you say, or your days of fishing, or your number of partridges. So those parameters still need to be somehow, like, and I guess I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Do you not run into sort of the same problem to an
the,
extent of, like, what's the right number of hooks, for example, or the right length of season days, or the right?
I think here's where we need to go. So the question you're asking is a really good one, because we're talking about how do we get from where we are now to where I'd like to be in 3 or 4 years' time. In 3 or 4 years' time, if we were using effort-based management, we would have 3 years of history that would give us, and we'd have stock assessment and so on, so we would know how we were doing. That intervening startup 3 years is, as you pointed out, a bit of a problem. So we always have to go back and look at what was. Now, I grew up before there was any quotas, and when I fished, the standard effort for a 2-person boat, fishing boat per day was 2,200 hooks, 4 11-line hooks. That's what everyone used. That was sort of and that took you all day to go out, set it out, haul it back, come in, go to the fish plant or split it, as the case may be, and then bait up again for the next day. So, and I fished with people who fished on the Grand Banks, dory fishing on the Grand Banks, back, one fellow, when I was a teenager, he was just getting, he was nearly 80, right? He had started fishing in the 1890s. So these are stories that I've learned, right? So I know how much effort used to be used for that 100 years, and you can quantify it, and 1,000 hooks per person per day is a standard that produces both a measurable effort and also one that produces a term that we've heard now, a moderate livelihood. So we can do that. Now there's a lot of learning involved and a lot of paradigm shift in your head about how to do that. But, you know, we've been looking at this now together for 4 years, and I've been thinking about it half my life. It's doable in a way that's much more accurate than
I'd like to confess that when Barry first told me about this thinking booth, the crazy idea that you could fish without quotas, I just thought, well, first I went, wow, what an original mind. But then I said, yeah, crazy. And then he told me about the real-time feedback that you get when you're fishing. Catch rates, how many hungry fish there are, what size of fish you're catching. If back in the days before quota, if the catch rates went down, it meant the fish weren't around anymore, and you did something else, or you caught something else, or you let off a bit, or you changed your method, or whatever. You got the feedback and you responded appropriately, right?
Yeah.
And so, but we've lost that now, because as long as you get your quota, that's what you're after, and you go out for as long, as far, as much, and you fish as long and as far away and as much as you can, because you've got this quota and you're going to get it, and that's all you're going to get, and you better darn well get it. Whereas if you're fishing by effort, and this is how he convinced me, if you're fishing by effort, you have the feedback right there. If somebody isn't catching, you know, if the harvesters out of a certain port are saying, as they did in the late 80s, early 90s, the fish are gone, you know, we're not catching anything, then the effort will decrease, because they're going to go and do something else. I don't know. Anyway,
Yeah,
go
okay.
on, Barry. It's that idea, the feedback and the response in real time to what's really happening there in the water.
now, because I think you can give us some good insight onto sort of the thinking inside of DFO, but I'm going to let a few other people do a question.
I think you can go. Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
This might be more of the discussion, if we want to move that way eventually, so we can put a pin in it if we need to. My name's Taylor. I work for EcoTrust Canada in fisheries policy, and we also support groups who are advocating for management regime changes, specifically on the Pacific coast, which is interesting because we often seem to discuss this like great ideas, like things like what Rick shared this morning, with like valuing that socioeconomic. So loving the overarching theme, and what I wanted to prod into and maybe there's ideas to be generated in the room is a couple of questions. What does that transition look like? And I know you kind of talking about it might be a bit messy as we figure it out, but if you had thought of specific or tangible steps of how, like first actions DFO could take, for example. And then the second kind of thing I wanted to prod at is if we're managing, I guess it's true, sorry, if we're managing effort, how do we decide who, if we say limit the number of harvesters? So who's going to make those decisions? And that ties into the capitalization. How do we address this issue that we've heard a lot about today? And then the capitalization driving the fisheries, a lot of the problem with consolidation and the overfishing because of the value of our fisheries. So a couple of different branches
okay.
there, but
I don't know if you heard the question I asked Rick, I think this morning, about, well, I'm starting with your second question first.
Yeah.
About, and you used the term limiting the harvesters. No, we've got a shortage of harvesters actually, well, at least they're granting, right?
Yeah.
Myself and Tony are examples of that, right? Because we're probably two of the last trap fishermen around. We're probably the only trap people who ever fished the cod traps. What we would advocate, and I spent one line on one slide about it, is a professionalization of harvesters, which would be akin to the way in which we certify trades, electricians, plumbers, sheet metal workers, and so on. But it could be something else. It could be the way we do able-bodied seamen or nurses or paramedics. But there needs to be some kind of system whereby if someone in high school goes into the guidance counselor and says, I want to be a nurse, what do I have to do? The guidance counselor will pull out the sheets and give you all the information. They go in now and says, how to become a harvester? they get a very odd answer. And we would advocate that the answer will be the same kind of answer you would get as if you were going to ask your guidance counselor, how do you become an electrician? It'll be go to school for 1 year. That will give you the right to get into a boat as a first-year apprentice. And then you work your way up until you become journeyman status or some equivalent of full-time professional harvester. And then you are entitled to fish whatever season is open in your area where your home quarters to, et cetera. You can work all these things in. Does that answer your second question?
Yeah, and I know you would ask Rick this morning, what is a harvester? How do we define that? And it's something that we struggle with and what we advocate for at Just Canada. And we use bona fide as the most specific term, I guess, and that's very much like what's written in the Atlantic updates. And the Gazette is actively on the vessel, like fishes their own license, actively is doing the work. And there's a couple little exceptions with like families and things like that, disabilities and directions, but we very much kind of follow that as what is a harvester. And I think that the idea of a certification or like a clear pathway to a fish harvester is a great idea, but then that talk earlier today also about what about that generational knowledge? What if you don't have the access needs to go to school to be a fish harvester, but you grew up on a boat? Like, how does that? I'm thinking about the equity of how does that disadvantage some people potentially versus others, and just
Well,
as a discussion,
It's 2022, and that's where I work. I worked in a technical college. So, and in the 70s, it was not uncommon, for example, when we had some of the newer trades coming along of grandfathering in people that were already in the fishery. So that's how you would deal with the current people that are there. And there's all kinds of tested way of doing that. I won't go into the details. But for someone new coming into, if someone new wants to get into the fishery, then they go through the same kind of process. That's how the new entries, and we would, I think, get more new entries. Okay. Now, you talked about the license, and the license as it exists now is really entitlement to a quota, if you think about it. And we're going to do away with that, right? I know that's the guy. That's what she said. Right? I mean, that's why.
no license and no quota.
Right?
No license and no quota, neither.
Well, the license is a license to fish, which you can earn by going to school and doing your apprenticeship, right?
Yeah.
So that gives you your license, right? I was a teacher, so I had a teaching license. My wife was a nurse, so she had an RN that gave her a right to practice nursing, but we couldn't sell it when we retired.
Okay.
And so that's the model that we would see for who's a harvester. And then, because then you can count them, no problem. That's a known that a manager can then say, how much pressure do we want on this particular stock?
I'm just thinking, we're getting into substantive discussion and we're talking a lot. There's a lot of silent people out there that haven't said anything yet. And I'm not sure what people's experience is either. So is there a way we can
Let me ask a
have
question.
almost a go round and then come back to some questions that we're going to put up on a slide in a minute for the larger discussion.
Okay, because we kind of arbitrarily said to you, we're not going to break up into, we're going to use this one group. Do you think it would be worthwhile for, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If 2 groups of 5 got together for 10 minutes and talked to each other, would that way you'd get more chance to talk? Or do you want to continue? There's a small enough of us here that we can be pretty flexible. And then we got any, would you like to talk to each other for a few minutes? Or would you want to keep talking Q&A kind of stuff?
Straw vote. Who wants to split? Who wants to divide into 2 groups?
Yeah, it's probably a good idea.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay.
And we'll sort of circulate.
Let's do
But
that part.
first, we're going to
You
put
have
up
the
a question.
I'm gonna kind of go out, you log on this.
Oops.
Sorry, funny.
So you want
Go back.
to.
There.
1, 2.
That's it.
2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And.
One, yes.
We have to go this way. Yes. And then we'll
Yes,
Okay, so, yeah, the current term, and then we'll come back up here.
I'll go join one of the discussions.
Yeah. I don't really think, especially when it comes to water, but you know, we don't want to buy it. So. Yeah, it's one of those things that. Like the blanket policy, a good idea, but I think like it's not as black and white as we think, and like, I know especially like, when it comes to fisheries, you don't want to go there and say, like, this is like going to be a fishery. It's not fisheries like that, so it just don't do that. It's going to come down to individual fisheries too.
And the history.
Based on the rights they go
Anybody
they'll teach their
who goes to school, we can do it.
some way to manage it, whether it's quota or anything else. It comes down to community. Even there's a fisheries aspect, and there's also the communities aspect. On top of that, the individual communities that have different needs based on size and number of members. So yeah, it's just not necessarily black and white for some fisheries.
Fishery justice.
Well, exactly. It's all gray.
You were there. You were
Yeah.
Never forget your vision. Sorry.
Indeed.
That's where my. Yeah.
Use a lot.
Here that has slight inefficiencies in the harvesters and formats that water has so that's gonna be more wear on the roads, more costs for fuel, and it will also take people like families who want to work. So there's impact on the line, but it's both the economics aspect and their timeline. So that is something that's there. It's not just the environment, but it's the people and their interaction. This year, I mean, we're already from this year. And that's a way to try to preserve marine mammal.
Yeah, there's lots of more, without, explanation. Well, it's not really going, fishing in Iceland, goes from daily down to, fishing in 2 years, here, we got to fall. So that's. Yeah, so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, there are some officials, if in your
That's, the natural mortality is, we don't know what's going on. We say it's natural mortality, for starters. We don't know what's going on. That's what it is.
Are there stations, so that's what I
No interest
still
in
be
it.
most effective. That's
I don't know.
Because they say
Yeah, that would be.
there's a 0.4 natural health, that means that 0.39, I could say.
It's not gonna be all at once.
Is that
all
true?
over, or on all species, but as include,
I think as well, it depends on like some system, like I said. One of the reasons why I started so high. Cautious.
then,
There's a. Right, then there's a.
that would take more of
that. Efficiency of the species, there's not, there's not. Climate change, there's reasons, so even if it's not mortality, it's necessary species
or some
that
areas
that
dying
dying
might do better with,
fish.
with a rapid-based approach. And it doesn't completely exclude, say, weak limits or something. I mean, it would have, we realize that this is just kind of a different way of coming at it than
I
not
think-
a restriction.
Like my interpretation is what they're getting to see this in a survey or whatever, although, I mean, it's true, like, there's a lot of, anyway, I do.
Limits.
Maybe something, maybe there's some changes or whatever, and then they're not there when they're fine, so unless they
Let's
like literally give away somewhere, we don't find it in that place. I find it hard to
Here
do
now,
now,
for
for
example, in,
find them. You know,
Well,
then-
I'm just assuming that we would have.
I think so, I do, I just want to think
for example, so that's
I don't think dollar in terms of
base
dollar.
way of managing at the local level that has been decided
No food.
years ago by
I
local
mean,
people.
you do have.
But I think that's where all I have said, you realize it's complicated.
Well, you know, close to them, but a rock on the. Doesn't matter, we know the rocks, we know we-
And I think that would be a serious.
Would have agreed, but it's a dog. That's a college problem. It's hard to do. You know, for fishermen, that's right. But that's, you know, for some reasons, but it, you have to have.
Although it seems like.
Firm, it's gotta be obvious, it's gotta be, you
Definitely
know,
like
proven,
different
be on the shelves of
species
that, before we say
management
that.
that
You
would
know
be
what happened,
And,
you now know, see them.
then you think about,
But there's no that, there's no things happening. We tend to take the all the answers, we don't have all the answers, we move to that. We go to this man's theory.
We're
the
definitely
difference
not.
is still there's a lot of things, that's. And we're constantly trying to rewrite history, all of us collectively, not only because because we never really understood what was there to begin with. You know, so we talk about what it was 100 years ago, and bugger up, you know what, we don't know, we don't know what the forces.
And so that's what.
But we do know that we had massive overfishing, while domestic and foreign, for 30 years, from 1960, late 50s. Overfishing by Canadian opera fleet, then an indoor fleet.
I mean, if you are a really service and stuff like that, then there would not really be test whether or not the practice is actually sustainable.
We also had environmental factors coming into play, so we had a perfect storm going on. Fish that stopped. And then, if you think about the environment today, I said, Years later, actually more crab than ever before. When we should be able to see, we should, with all the work that we were talking about, we should be able to see, but we didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's one thing to do is that they're not cohabiting very well. You know, shellfish and fish.
Yeah.
If you know that, that's, you know, but if we ever take concern of it's not the word that's what we do.
Well, I think
That's
that's
right.
it.
That's
I think that's great. Okay. So what we got to do is at the base have to do that such and such is in, and then it's I think hard science as well. It's kind of shifting the social science, like, oh yeah, that's not more in our major thing. Sure, if you don't know.
But scenarios for
businesses, that's why you're not doing it.
would be very useful or
But it's not in the fishery.
keeping in mind that
The resource that belongs to everybody. No, they get rid of like you that you do it, nobody does. Right? So all I can ever do is a group of people that are out there fishing. And then you might transition from where we are now. Back to, when you go, back to where we were.
Scenarios, so.
In the eyes of our folks, Mr. Dominic Canada had to boy out, I just wanted to get his very. Had to boy out, now, people, we'll let Dominic Canada go back there. We'll just move it forward.
The biggest thing that I see from like the
So
government side is the
Yeah.
timeline just to be implemented, because I know that we are stretched thin with capacity. Incorporate something like that, program such as into the government. Constantly sponsoring the building
And
would be quickly from, we are
the fishing.
the best.
Very good.
Bandwidth capacity, so
Okay, yeah.
having people in the tribe allocated to do something like this, because that would
Only
essentially
after fishing
turn
comes
many of
here.
the policies that are already in place. So we were to look at a bunch of different stocks and see how things can be changed, and I know that there's
Is
a lot
we
of
run
management
some
plans,
whatever
everything will
resource is.
change.
And that may be enough, has to be. So we have them.
And just see, you know, which ones do, I think a lot of them actually do, like, we worry about the who, the how, the when, and the where, so even if, yeah, once, on top of that, it's pretty efficient stuff. We'll be up for some of those fishes are first certified, they might not have the how, they are available, but they do have the season zone. So it'd be interesting to map out the amounts that are checked box and where the happens. Like to identify essentially the utilization from your framework, you know, looking forward, from my experience, all of those things are
So
controversial.
they very well,
The who specific started, and it's a lot more, one of the challenges I'm seeing in the way that they're actually hitting on a number of changes, not just quota-based, the effort, where you watch out, basically, it's no longer fishery, would cause
and a number of other problems.
catastrophe.
That's right.
Would cause catastrophe, so where it's
That's
all
what you're.
for the idea that you go to big school and then get access to fishery, to bases the current limited interest of fishery. Current license holders would be very much against that. But it's also important to note that we're a problem. So that's technically legally. So that it is. We know.
That's so simplistic. It would cause us no problem.
now might be the time to cause that issue.
It's not like something.
Caitlin, I don't know, I mean, I think you're right, and stuff, it's like, for all intents and purposes, this is not, and it's not.
I've had tell this one. Right? Well, the people stop, right? So here's the oil that goes across. It's fun. This oil that goes across by birds and whales and consumed by ground fish. And it just happens, it is harvested, and not taken by commercial fish. Come on, what? Like, but the world believes it. It's so silly. Keeping the removals to a minimum, a minimum. It's all about that. It's not about, I mean, it shouldn't be overflowing about how much. What is actually happening out here, how can we interact as you say?
I think it's an experience, like in the second point, still, right? All right, I had to go on contact, so I'm still a little blind now. So, like, everything's blurred. It's like a proper planner, I think. Your idea that, what you're saying going back.
But
So it's
another
the
issue
same
that's
one.
not, it's not effort to hold. It's just that it is destructive fishing practice, we shouldn't do any.
I will
So,
say
and-
that. It's not like practice, I do that.
It's like, it's separate from all the other
Quotas
issues.
and limited
It's like a.
by that licenses. on the-
It's so bad.
Yeah.
Licenses,
Whether it's
yeah.
any efforts to
That
control or
accelerated
control,
capitalization.
still shouldn't be small.
Now, our
Yeah.
self-corporations are starting to apply their monopolies and make it rich
Or
and.
just the argument between quotas.
Yeah, have the right, you know, that was necessary.
And now all the. You know, we couldn't repopulate the land because the charge came back. Because guess what? Our population and demographics is going down. You know, like that's not a fallacy. We populated. More. Okay, everybody,
We're back.
we're back and we're at the end of the discussion, but I think we've got, what, 5 minutes? What do we have?
I still got about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, all right. Okay, salient points, a little bit of exchange. I took a few notes from one of the points that was made at the table I was at was that with the slow fishing, people would be longer at sea, and there are economic and social and safety concerns with that. And that another point was that it could be different for different species in different places and that sort of thing. I mentioned that we need to do some scenarios, that maybe the next step is doing scenarios for different groups of species or whatever. And the fact was raised that DFO does use other tools as well, and we said, yes, we're aware of that. And anyway, so, and then from the, you tell me what I'm missing, but also from the other table.
Do you want to add something from that table down here? Anyone want to make what we've been calling salient points? Okay, do one of you ladies want to make a, what did you hear? Did you hear anything that was? Can't hear it.
The big theme was multiply respect to where we've already been. Maybe that, you know, we're gonna end up putting these rules out there and on top of each other. We'll be very consistent in reaching their. It's a very confusing conversation. There's a lot about history. Coming here and realizing that a long time ago, we didn't actually know what was there. So we're basically but my biggest question was, where do you see the licenses going?
The what?
Where do you see the licenses going? Like, if now we can hand out a license to anyone who gets a certification. What is your prediction? Do you think people would stick around and do that?
I think that the where, this is very much a where do we go from here point in time. And I think chances of going where we're suggesting, the things that are against it happening are quite high, and the chances of it happening the way I would like to see it happening are pretty slim. I think we're going to be muddling through with quotas for a long time to come, and we will continue to be making mistakes and things will go wrong. I'll just give you a couple simple examples now. We had a glut of crab. Part of that is because DFO did not limit the number of traps in the water. Right? That's a management decision, and DFO is the manager. We've had a successful squid fishery in the last 2 or 3 years. Why? Because there wasn't a quota. Because they didn't get around. I heard fellow fishermen said it's a good thing DFO didn't have wasn't managing squid because they would have ruined it. Right? So it was the absence of a quota in the squid fishery which enabled people to make a lot of money very, very efficiently with squid. So our basic premise is we have to, if not entirely get rid of quota, it can no longer be the be all and the end all. It can't be that quota limits the season. Quota can limit everything. And as to who fishes, we don't say you can't be a nurse, you can't be a teacher, you can't be a doctor. It works. Society works. And we managed to come up with roughly enough people to do the work that's going to be done. And I don't see why that wouldn't be true in fishery and fishing as well.
Well, one other point that was made, and I missed the beginning of the conversation at the table that I went to, I'm sorry. But another point that was made was that steps towards this kind of change, if it were to be considered, would people are stretched, DFO staff are stretched as it is, and it would, the change is so enormous, it would certainly take a long time. So that was another point. And what was the conversation that I missed? Because you were speaking when I came to the table, and then I sort of that kind of stopped. What was going on there?
Oh, I was just talking about Indigenous fisheries and First Nations, and each community is very different, and each nation is very different. So, and especially when it comes to fisheries like moderate livelihoods, the only people that can
talk about moderate livelihood fisheries or define what a moderate livelihood fishery is that community, and that's gonna look different for each community. And the only people that can regulate them really are themselves. So like a framework like this is great in theory, but especially when it comes to First Nations fisheries, which wasn't touched on here. Like, how is that going to be navigated around, or like how are you going to engage or consult with First Nations about something like this? Because they're a huge player at the table, whether it's moderate livelihood, conservative ceremonial, we have all kinds of different First Nations fisheries, and I think each one has to be approached on its own, and each community has to be approached on its own. So you think just in Nova Scotia, you have 8 mainland communities, you have 5 up in Cape Breton, and then you're, so each one is just so different and unique, and the needs of those communities are all different. So that was something that I just kind of raised, that was something that wasn't touched on here, but is definitely a huge player in terms of fisheries.
With just a question to you, when you talk about, because we've looked at some of the Indigenous questions, and where we look at Indigenous and Aboriginal fisheries all over the world, it is often where people are catching fish for themselves to eat for food. And certainly in Newfoundland, there's more than enough for us to eat by far. We will export 99% of it. So we don't need to limit any fish caught for food. It doesn't make any sense. And so in the case of the Indigenous rights, if they're going to have rights to feed themselves, there's no problem, in my opinion. If they're going to export it, and there's no limit on the export, then we got a problem. So
On the export or on the methods used.
well, we could come to that in a minute, but you don't need to spend a lot of money if you just get food to eat. Right? So when you talk about Indigenous rights, are you talking about for food or for producing it for a fish plant so you can?
For both, because even when it comes to moderate livelihood, it's not necessarily just for feeding yourself and your family, you're also doing it to make your livelihood, which then involves selling it to whoever, whether you're exporting it, you're selling it within the province, within your community, you're keeping some for yourself. But again, it depends on each fisher, each community, what licenses they hold. So it's a very diverse topic that has a lot of factors.
Anyone from this table want to add on?
We go for 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Yes. I I was an instructor, so there was we didn't know that there was an exam at the end of the course. But it's just a feedback, it's a survey evaluation. So we just like to know what you think.
And so while Barry is distributing those, I'll just, since we have about 1 minute. We've come to the end. We've come to the end of our session. Our thanks to the Congress organizers for affording us this opportunity. Special thanks to Evan for his personal assistance. And please fill out the form before you Today we present you with an alternative vision of how things might be managed. We hope to leave with a different perspective and on the important role that small scale fisheries will play in the future. Let's all be part of getting fish harvesting policy right.
Yeah.
Not for that at all.
Lobster.